Governments prepare for conflict. Militaries prepare for conflict. But what about you and me? So, what can you do to prepare for war? Is daunting, but it's one we can address methodically and without panic. So let's find out what's actually going on with Donald Trump and his political games. In an unprecedented gathering that has sent ripples through the national security community, former President Donald Trump addressed a room of approximately 800 of the nation's top generals and admirals, delivering a speech that framed a new and contentious mission for the United States Armed Forces. During his remarks, he articulated a stark shift in focus, suggesting that after decades of international military engagements, the primary adversary may now be domestic. He described this threat as an enemy from within, a faceless opponent that, in his view, poses a challenge more complex than a foreign foe because they do not wear uniforms. The former president critiqued past national priorities, questioning why American forces would be deployed to distant nations, while, as he claimed, the country faces an internal invasion. He reiterated this point for emphasis, stating that this internal conflict is tantamount to a war being waged from inside the nation's borders. This question becomes an escalation in his long-standing narrative about domestic threats and aligns with his broader efforts to position the military as a key instrument for domestic law enforcement, a role traditionally constrained by long-standing legal and constitutional principles. The audience for these comments was particularly noteworthy, consisting of the very military leadership that would be responsible for implementing such a directive, and crucially, for refusing any order deemed unlawful. Analysts observing the event noted the profound implications of delivering such a message directly to this group. One senior defense expert pointed out that while the sentiments were consistent with the former president's past statements, the context was uniquely concerning. Addressing the senior-most military officials in this manner was seen as a direct signal, testing the waters of their allegiance and potentially seeking to secure their ideological conformity by framing compliance as essential for career advancement and institutional protection. This event is part of a larger pattern that has alarmed civil military scholars, who warn that such efforts aim to reshape the military's nonpartisan role in American society. The objective, they suggest, is a fundamental reorientation where the armed forces might no longer be perceived as serving the entire public impartially, but rather as advancing the interests of a specific political faction. The gravity of the moment was underscored by the former president's opening remarks, which included a pointed warning to the assembled officers that anyone who disagreed with his forthcoming message was free to leave, but at the cost of their rank and future. This address did not occur in a vacuum. It came on the heels of tangible actions, such as the deployment of hundreds of National Guard soldiers to Portland, where the former president asserted federal authority by force. In that situation, he publicly authorized the military to use what he termed full force against what he labeled domestic terrorists, illustrating a tangible move towards employing the armed forces for domestic policing. Together, the speech and these deployments have ignited a critical national conversation about the boundaries of military power, the sanctity of constitutional oaths, and the very definition of the enemies the military is sworn to confront. A significant legal and constitutional challenge is emerging from the Pacific Northwest, where senior law enforcement officials in Oregon and Portland have formally contested the federal government's deployment of military assets to their city. In court documents filed on Monday, these officials stated that the deployment of National Guard soldiers is an unnecessary escalation, asserting that recent gatherings outside a federal immigration facility have been peaceful demonstrations, fully protected by the constitutional right to assembly. This legal pushback highlights a deepening rift between local authorities and the federal administration over the role of the military in American civic life. The core of the dispute centers on a foundational American principle, the clear separation between the armed forces and domestic policing. This principle exists for a critical reason, as experts point out that the military's training and purpose are fundamentally different from those of civilian law enforcement. The military's training is oriented towards engaging and defeating foreign adversaries with overwhelming force, a mission starkly at odds with the nuanced work of policing, which requires de-escalation and the protection of civilian rights. This philosophical divide was thrown into sharp relief during an unprecedented gathering of the nation's top military leadership, where the rhetoric appeared to align with a more aggressive domestic posture. Prior to the main address, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth spoke to the assembled generals and admirals, advocating for a radical shift in military policy. He argued that the established rules of engagement, which govern when and how troops may use force, should no longer constrain the U.S. military. Hegseth called for unleashing overwhelming and punishing violence on the enemy and for untying the hands of warfighters to intimidate, demoralize, and kill the nation's enemies, dismissing the current protocols as politically correct and overbearing. This language, while typically reserved for foreign battlefields, was delivered without a clear definition of who the enemy now is, raising urgent questions about the intended target of this newly proposed lethality. Analysts observing the event expressed deep concern, noting that the ambiguity leaves a dangerous opening for the military to be turned inward, potentially for the purpose of exercising control over the American public, a possibility that, while not stated explicitly, was heavily implied between the lines. This strategic direction is not limited to Portland. The administration has extended its policy of military deployment to several other American cities, including Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Memphis, Tennessee, consistently acting over the firm objections of state and local leaders who argue that the presence of federal troops is inflammatory and unwarranted. Furthermore, the former president has repeatedly threatened to send troops into Chicago, reiterating those threats in the same forum before the country's highest-ranking military officials. These actions represent a concerted effort to test the boundaries of long-standing legal statutes. Under normal circumstances, federal law, most notably the Posse Comitatus Act, imposes strict limits on the president's authority to use the military for domestic law enforcement. However, the Trump administration has actively worked to push the limits of these laws or find legal loopholes to circumvent them between soldiers and police officers, and redefines the concept of domestic security. In a striking address to a gathering of the nation's most senior military leaders, former President Donald Trump framed a stark new vision for the role of the United States Armed Forces, one focused on perceived internal threats and the use of American cities as training grounds for domestic operations. During his speech, he presented a dire portrait of the country's urban centers, falsely claiming that conditions in some of America's largest cities, including the nation's capital, were worse than some battlefields familiar to the officials in attendance. This characterization served as a foundation for his central proposition, that these urban landscapes should become practical training environments for the military, a suggestion that blurs the long-established lines between civilian spaces and theaters of war. The former president repeatedly invoked the specter of an enemy from within, an unidentified internal force that he stated the military must assist in subduing. To confront this vague adversary, he referenced an executive order he signed the previous month, which directed the Secretary of Defense to prepare National Guard units across all states to be ready to quell civil disturbances. He described this initiative as a big thing for the military leaders present, essential for handling the internal enemy before the situation spirals out of control. This executive order has been interpreted by legal experts and former military officials as a significant step toward creating a national, militarized police force under the direct control of the president, a move that challenges foundational principles of civil-military relations. While the former president did not explicitly define who constitutes this enemy from within, he provided strong indications through his concurrent political attacks. He used the platform to label Democrats as bad people who do not respect the military, directly likening his political opponents to the adversaries that troops face on foreign battlefields. He described them as vicious people that must be fought, asserting that his political foes are a different kind of vicious than traditional combatants. This rhetoric culminated in a closing message that powerfully conflated domestic political enemies with foreign threats to national security. In his final remarks, he vowed to vanquish every danger and crush every threat to American freedom, creating a direct and unambiguous link between his political adversaries and the existential dangers that the military is traditionally tasked to defeat, thereby signaling a profound and controversial new mission for the country's armed forces. Trump and his laws are day by day frightening the world. Don't you think it's a hint towards a war? Share your respectful perspectives in the comments below. And for more deep dives into the stories behind the news, make sure to subscribe.